In many art museums, you can find beautiful things that were created especially for churches or for worship. Images of Jesus or of the saints, items for the altar, vestments, communion vessels, all finely crafted of very exquisite, expensive materials. We know God, our Creator, delights in the handiwork of His children, and we know that beautiful things can inspire us and lift up our minds and hearts. And so as we see things that are beautiful, they remind us of the beauty of God. Just last Sunday, a couple of visitors stopped in because they had heard about our church. They said we were on a list of some of the most beautiful churches in St. Louis, and they wanted to see for themselves the beauty that we enjoy every time we gather here. Today, our gospel takes us to a beautiful place. We're invited with Jesus and his disciples to visit the temple in Jerusalem. It was a really remarkable place because the next verse following today's gospel has the disciples just bubbling over with enthusiasm. They were just amazed, saying, "Rabbi, look at the size of these stones. Look at these magnificent buildings." The temple was indeed constructed on enormous foundation stones that had been carved just for that purpose. The sanctuary itself was faced with white marble. There were capitals and cornices around the exterior of the building covered with gold. All of this very dazzling in the sunlight, so it was certainly an overwhelming thing for pilgrims and visitors to see. Now today, that's all gone. The only thing that remains are some of those huge foundation stones. They were left behind by the Romans who destroyed the temple, but they wanted to leave a witness of what they had destroyed as an example to everyone else. Now, we practical Americans sometimes question money that's spent on temples and churches and things of that nature, the treasures that were given to the church and some of the very expensive things that are still used today for worship. We say, well, God doesn't need those things. Simple things would be good enough, and the money could be used for much better purposes. Never mind that Americans spend about $10 billion a year just on Halloween. Now, certainly Jesus, though he was the Son of God, came into our world in poverty and lived as a poor man all his life. He never commanded his apostles to make silver or gold vessels for the Eucharist, never commanded us to decorate beautiful places for worship. But when the Christians began to build their own houses of worship, they provided the best they could. And the thought was, well, if royalty can eat from golden dishes, why not serve the body and blood of Christ, the bread of life, on worthy vessels as well, for all to share in? For Jesus truly is the King of all kings. And so they did, as we know. Now, already in the 4th century, St. John Chrysostom, a bishop of Constantinople, Eastern Roman Empire, complained that the wealthy were giving too much in this way. Too much finery given to the church, but the point was they were also neglecting the poor. John said, God does not want golden vessels, he wants golden hearts. I'm not forbidding you to make such gifts, but demand that along with them and before them you give alms. Of what use is it to cover Christ's table with golden cups when Christ himself is dying of hunger? Will you have a golden cup made but not give a cup of water? First fill Christ when he is hungry, then use what is left to adorn his table. But let us also notice, as Jesus and the apostles did in the gospel story today, the people who were there, the visitors and the pilgrims, the Jews and the Gentiles who'd come from many places. And much as we do today, they did not bring the actual things to be offered in the sacrifices. They did not bring the animals, the bread, the wine, the oil, the incense, and so on. Instead, they gave gifts of money. Today's gospel refers to a treasury. This was an area adjacent to the temple, and we are told there were 13 containers outside, each marked for something to be used in worship or for the repair of the building itself. So certainly there was much given out of generosity. People wanted to make sure that the worship of the temple was maintained. But as we read the gospel story, we might ask, well, what was the good of a penny? It probably wouldn't even have bought a grain of incense in those days. And yet Jesus commends the widow because she has that golden heart. She has a deep desire to be part of the worship of God. Her offering was perfect because it represented herself and her life. She was doing what the words of last week's gospel commanded, that we love the Lord our God with everything we are, give everything we have. Jesus saw that the woman had really arrived at such a complete trust in God that she could literally give all, freely and joyfully. And this is how she was already participating in the spirit of Jesus' own sacrifice. As we read in the letter to the Hebrews today, Jesus offered one eternal sacrifice, the gift of himself in love to his Father. And as Hebrew puts it, this is what it means to enter the true sanctuary, the sanctuary of God's heart, of which all earthly temples are just outward symbols. Today, as we call to mind the opportunity that we have to give worship and praise to God, we know that we can give thanks generously, joyfully, eagerly, as we offer our prayers together, singing our songs and participating in the liturgy. But we also know, as St. John reminded us, that we also worship and serve Christ by caring for him as he is in the poor. Today, especially throughout our diocese and in our parish here, we remember and we celebrate those in our parish who do give of themselves to God and neighbor in the service of our neighbors in need. Especially today, we honor the members of our St. Vincent de Paul Society. These volunteers are an essential part of our worship because they do exactly what John Chrysostom preached about. They feed and house and comfort the Christ who feeds and comforts all of us. We pray today that God will give us the grace to always give freely and always give with joy. And once again, as we give our hearts to join in the Eucharist, joyfully offering ourselves to God with Christ, we pray that God will also fill us up again, that we may generously give and serve all the neighbors who show us Christ's face.